Violence, and I'd like to welcome you to our congressional briefing honoring Sexual Assault Awareness Month. First, to start off with a little housekeeping, we have English to Spanish and Spanish to English interpretation. So if everyone will please click on the globe at the bottom of your screen and choose which language you'd want to be your primary language. If you're on a phone, you'll have to click more for that. And I'm going to turn over to Vanessa really quickly, one of our interpreters, to give that same instruction in Spanish.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos. El día de hoy tenemos interpretación simultánea al español, entonces por favor encuentren el icono del globo en su pantalla si están en la computadora o los tres puntitos que dice more o más y allí van a encontrar lo que dice language interpretation, interpretación del idioma y elijan por favor inglés o español. Si es bilingüe, por favor elija el idioma en el que prefiere escuchar. Gracias, thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And just want to let everyone know that this event will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on social media and various websites. So please feel free to consider your participation based on the recording. Please remain muted throughout the webinar, and please keep your video off unless you're presenting or a speaker. And you can choose up at the top with your view, you can choose speaker view if you want to make sure to see the speaker in the biggest format possible. We hope to have time at the end for your questions and some discussion, and we ask that we do that through the chat. So you can put your questions and comments in the chat throughout. We have several staff members who can may be able to answer your questions as we're going along, and we certainly can come at the end and make sure you get an answer to your question. My hope is that this briefing will be of benefit to survivors, to our communities, and everyone here, and we really appreciate you joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and our wonderful leader, Monica Johnson-Hostler, President of the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and all of our staff who's supporting this virtual platform today. I know it's not easy, and thank you all for joining us. We are excited today that we have two honorary co-hosts who've sponsored this virtual platform event today, Senators Murray and Shaheen and Murkowski, as well as Representative Moore, who you'll hear from shortly, as well as the House Bipartisan Task Force Against Sexual Assault, led by Representative Custer, Spear, Joyce, and Katko. We are extremely honored to have greetings from two of our co-hosts join us today, and one is already on camera. So it's my great privilege to first introduce and welcome Representative Gwen Moore, representing Wisconsin 4th District in Milwaukee, a longtime champion for sexual assault survivors, leader of the House Dear Colleague letter on VAWA funding, and an all-around amazing advocate. And you've done this both in person, so we're excited to definitely have you virtually with us today. Representative Moore, would you like to share a few words?
Well, thank you so very, very much. It is really so good to be here. As I often say, I appreciate organizations like the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, but I sure am in the business of putting you guys out of work. I would love for my great-granddaughters to just sit around someday and say, great-grandmother, I mean, did people really beat up their partners, people that they say that they love? Did this really, really happen? Was there such a time? And so we're working toward that goal, to put ourselves all out of business. But in the meantime, we know how important our work is, Monica. I just want to acknowledge the president of the National Association to End Sexual Violence, Tammy Zhang. I mean, the director, you, and then Tammy Zhang, the executive director of the Hmong American Women's Association, who's a constituent of mine, and Tammy Giroux from the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, Lynn Charlotte, executive director of the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, Teresa Stafford, chief operating officer for Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. In other words, everywhere. This scourge is everywhere. And everywhere we need people to organize. I am from Milwaukee. Wisconsin, but not only am I the congresswoman from Milwaukee, I'm a person who has survived sexual assault, domestic violence. And so I am here with people, and we're all joining together as survivors now to really set the table for making sure that people who were in my situation oh so many years ago have and there was no hotline to call when I was experiencing sexual violence. There was no counselor. There were no police officers trained to examine me. There were no rape kits. These were the days where if you got in the car with the man, then you must be consenting to have sex with him. But that being said, I just want to lift up one of the real sheroes of this movement, and that's Tammy Zhang. I mean, she's a champion in this fight against the scourge of domestic and sexual violence. And she's also a leader in our exceptional Hmong community. And it's advocates like her who help guide my work in Congress. When people say that they know what's happening on the ground, they don't know unless they talk to people like Tammy. And this past year has been tough, y'all. I mean, from healthcare to housing to violence, this pandemic has rocked us all. And even those who haven't experienced the death of loved ones, some of us have just wished we were dead from all the pain that we have suffered. For the first time in many years, as you might suspect, instances of domestic and sexual violence escalated in increased numbers, but not only the numbers of violence, but escalated in the manner of the violence and in the severity of the violence. And these issues have always been malignant in our community, but like so many other issues, COVID-19 shed a light on where we're failing. And Safer at Home, it certainly was not safe for many, many women. But 2021 is the year of the survivor. We're vaccinated and we're pushing back. In March, we passed the Violence Against Women Act, a reauthorization that was comprehensive and progressive in its mission, including two of my amendments. One that would require the Department of Health and Human Services to study the link between intimate partner violence and maternal mortality. And the other that would expand the sexual assault forensic medical and advocacy services for tribes. That's called FAST, Native American. Our Native American people certainly deserve to have that, and so I wanted to make sure that I was very involved in that. I'm going to grab some more of my notes here as soon as I find them. I can't see. Anyway, I think the word is that I'm talking too much. But I'll just finish this presentation real quick. We're going to, like I said, two of them. One studying violence and maternal mortality. I mean, because Black women, brown women are dying worse than women in so-called third world countries. And again, our Native American sisters really need funds to increase the sexual assault forensic exams. I mean, they've got, you talk about rape kits that never go anywhere, just deal with Native American women. Also, I did an amendment for the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's nursing program. They receive these funds and they work with Great Lakes Tribal Council members. And so I want to expand the outreach to this. But VAWA reauthorization is not just the ceiling, it's the floor at which we got to continue to work on. And that's why I continue to push measures to strengthen and improve our nation's response to intimate partner violence. I mean, there's probably 4 women today who are going to die. At some point, this gets to be our cousin and our sister and our mother. and there's no escape from it. I certainly have known more than one person who's died from this kind of violence. And it's incredible now that we got a president in the White House and a vice president who actually gets this. Joe Biden was the original author of VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. And in his presidential budget, he asked for an unprecedented $1 billion to end gender-based violence. And as the author of the VAWA appropriations request, you know I'm here to do this. I'm right on board with that $1 billion because we are so worth it. I'm so honored to be here with you all virtually, elevating work that you have done to shed light on this. Again, thank you so much for having me here. And I yield back to you now, Madam President.
Thank you so much. That sounds so formal coming from you, Congresswoman, that you're yielding the floor back to me. But it is certainly my great privilege to have yielded the floor to you to not only talk about what people would generally call talking points, but you always make it personal, both for your community and your own experiences. And I know for certain both survivors and the advocates who are listening now and who will listen later are grateful the way that you bring your full self to this work. And we certainly know that as an appropriator, you will be supporting, and you always have been. So thank you personally for joining us, and always thank you for sharing a piece of yourself with us and highlighting the important work that people like Tammy do. And I love the chat of giving Tammy all of her shout out. So we certainly do believe in supporting our advocates every day for the great work they do in community. Thank you so, and we consider you one of those advocates alongside of us. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Moore.
And thank you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So at this time, we will move to a video of Congressman Joyce representing Ohio's 14th district. However, if he does get the opportunity to join us in person, we will pause where we are and yield the full floor to Congressman Joyce if he joins us. He is the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force on Sexual Assault and a supporter of both the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization and the VOCA fix bill. Terry, Maureen, I'm sure you're navigating and may not be able to see the chat, but we are unable to hear. You're also muted as well, my friend.
So sorry. So sorry you couldn't hear that. Let's move forward and know that Representative Joyce really wanted to sincerely greet us today. And Monica, now
Thank
you're
you. Thank you. And as stated, he may join us in person. And if so, again, we will take a pause at that moment to allow him to speak to you. But again, please note that he did record a video and was looking forward to being with us and sharing very similar words to Congresswoman Moore of supporting the work that you all do in the field and being a supporter for us in Congress. So while today our briefing is primarily geared towards congressional staff, we are also pleased to have, as I shared, the many advocates from across the country who are able to be with us today, who do the frontline work, who are both persistent in their efforts to support survivors to end sexual violence and persistent in their work to support our public policy work by providing your experiences, the voices of survivors, so that we may continue to center our public policy work on those experiences. This April, during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we cannot help but reflect on the past year. As you heard Congresswoman Moore state, it is a year that has certainly highlighted the faultiness of all of our infrastructures in this country, both personal, both those who, so whether that's our healthcare system, but also it noted the faultiness of the way that we currently lived our lives as human beings, and recognizing that our advocates, like everyone else, were both providing direct services while also navigating their own challenging roads. And I think the way that our advocates across this country were able to quickly transition their work to meet the needs, whether it was moving to virtual platforms for support services, both individual and counseling services, but also the shift to moving towards virtual sexual assault exams, as you heard Representative Congresswoman Moore speak to, the now availability, but still all of the broken pieces attached to that. We also watched agencies across this country when our country closed in March. April was right upon us, and watched them close and end and cancel many direct service events that would have allowed them to raise funding. And the impact that had on our funding to our rape crisis centers during that transition is monumental and still being felt today. But we can't be remiss without celebrating in the midst of that, because of your stories, completing our surveys, that we were able, with the help of our staff, and you've heard Terry Poor speak, so please also give her roses and her due today for the hard work to ensure that the American Rescue Plan included $198 million for rape crisis centers. Unprecedented amount, but also unprecedented that it directly speaks to the work of our direct service providers like yourselves who have joined us today and whom you'll be hearing from. During all of this change and transition, one thing remains constant. The needs of survivors remain the focal point of local programs, state coalitions, as well as the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. We've been living through a time of tremendous progress and honestly, a time of reckoning to reckon with the problem of sexual violence in our country, and survivors' voices and their courage has been the driving force for that change, whether it's addressing sexual assault in the military, in our schools, in our faith community, on our college campuses, or if it's creating policies to address those things, as well as moving forward, how do we end first-time perpetration of sexual violence and believing that prevention truly is possible. So a briefing like this addresses sexual violence, but at the same time, we remain focused on the core federal legislation and funding programs that ensure survivors can receive those services and that our advocates can provide those services, including our prevention efforts. According to our most recent survey, 62% of rape crisis centers have a waiting list for counseling service. 35% of those lack full-time therapists on staff. And we believe Congress has the ability to address the waiting list to ensure that every survivor has access to counseling throughout this country. Our speakers today will touch on key federal programs like the Victims of Crime Act, the Sexual Assault Services Program, as well as the Rape Prevention Education Program that really provide the backbone and infrastructure of the support of rape crisis centers throughout this country. I will now read a brief bio of all of our speakers, and you will not hear from me, but that you will be able to hear from the speakers who do this work firsthand and will be able to share their experiences as it relates to the federal programs that we were speaking of today. First, my dear and longtime friend and colleague, Lynn Shillette, who is the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, a statewide network of 12 community-based rape crisis centers. In this role, Lynn collaborates with member programs to advance trauma-informed services for victims, fosters statewide collaborations to advance the interest of victims in crisis centers, and is a strategic leader in the public messaging and awareness regarding victims' rights and experiences. Prior to this, Lynn served as the general counsel for many years of the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault, where our paths first crossed, for over 16 years, where she played a key leadership role in drafting and passage of implementation of several laws impacting rape victims, including the first standalone protective order for rape victims in the country and a civil cause for action for gender-based violence. Thank you for joining us, Lynn. Following Lynn, we'll have Teresa Stafford, who serves as the Chief Program Officer at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, one of the largest independent rape crisis centers in the country. Its mission is to support survivors of rape and sexual abuse, promote healing and prevention, and advocate for social change in our community. As Chief Program Officer, Teresa advocates for systemic change needed to create the climate that trauma-informed and inclusive for all survivors and oversees all direct services programming. Thank you as well for joining us. Next, you've already heard about the phenomenal Tammy Zhang, who currently serves as the Executive Director of the Hmong American Women's Association in Milwaukee, home of Congresswoman Gwen Moore, the only Southeast Asian women and queer femme-led organization in Milwaukee dedicated to the safety of Southeast Asian women, girls, queer, and trans people experiencing violence. She has spent over 14 years in her community to address violence against women, girls, queer, and trans people, and works to end all forms of violence. Again, thank you for having us. And as you will note, you have a great fan club in the chat. Next, we will hear from Tammy Truitt-Giroux, an Anvik tribal member currently residing in Fairbanks, Alaska. After living and working for the past 25 years in Anvik, Alaska, a small community on the Yukon River, she is the mother of 4 children and the grandmother of 5 grandchildren. She has worked in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, intersecting issues for over the last 40 years in various capacities. She has been involved with many nonprofit boards over the years and have worked most of her professional life in rural tribal Alaska, providing direct services in many fields such as therapist, sexual assault counselor, teacher, tribal administrator, social worker, and social work trainer for the state and tribes, as well as the tribal director of social services. As you will note, we will be rounding out with number of decades. I mean, if I counted just a few, we're talking over 8 decades of supportive services and direct advocacy across this country. It is my pleasure to turn it over to our first speaker. And again, thank you all for joining us. Lynn.
Great, wonderful. Good afternoon. Thank you, Monica. It's wonderful to see so many faces on our webinar this afternoon. Again, my name is Lynn Shillette with the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I want to thank the Alliance and also a quick shout out to 2 of our honorary co-hosts today, longtime champions, Senator Shaheen and Congresswoman Custer. So we thought we'd start today by just chatting for a moment with some of you about kind of the structure of the work we do. I told you that I come from a state sexual assault and domestic violence coalition. What is that? That is an umbrella organization for our 12 member programs who do the on the ground direct service work that you are going to hear about from several of the other speakers today. Coalitions are statewide or territory-wide partners to the local crisis centers. And we play many roles in supporting local rape crisis centers with the overall goal of a strong statewide response to sexual assault. So for example, we bring together professionals at the rape crisis centers who perform the same job to give them training and advice and technical assistance. We engage in statewide work such as public policy. And in many states, including New Hampshire, we administer the federal funding to the programs, which is really kind of what we're here to talk about today. Specifically today, I'd like to focus on one important funding stream in the Violence Against Women Act, which Monica mentioned, and specifically the role that coalitions and rape crisis centers can play in implementing those funds. And that fund is the RPE, or Rape Prevention Education Funds. These are federal funds that are administered by the Centers for Disease Control via a formula to states and territories to be used specifically for primary prevention. So what is primary prevention? Primary prevention is stopping sexual violence, victimization, and perpetration before it starts. As a movement, we've gotten really adept at the response to crisis after a sexual assault happens. But we are really only going to stop interpersonal violence if we address its underlying causes and move upstream. So I'd like to illustrate how we're doing that in New Hampshire. As a state in New Hampshire, we receive about $295,000 in RPE funds, a little over $300,000 for our whole state. And we do 2 things with those dollars. Some of them we retain at the coalition office to fund a single position who is a prevention coordinator for our state. The rest of those funds get divided among the 12 crisis centers in New Hampshire. So why does that work well? Why is that a model that we're advocating as we're all talking about reauthorization of VAWA? In terms of having a centralized prevention coordinator at our office, this individual works daily with the educators at the crisis centers. Those prevention educators are out in their communities, they're at schools, they're at community centers, they're in faith communities providing this primary prevention programming. The coordinator understands every aspect of their prevention work, which means that they can be a resource and a trainer for those educators. In addition, the CDC places quite a few requirements on that programming. So an example would be right now that they are encouraging prevention programming to move toward more community level strategies. By having a statewide person in our coalition office, she's able to be the intermediary between that CDC requirement and the prevention educators on the ground. So I see a question popping up. Yes, we are a pass-through organization, Rosa. Thank you for asking that question. Another benefit of having a statewide prevention coordinator based at a coalition is that we can have a coordinated statewide response to projects and initiatives. So a great example would be that New Hampshire last year passed the most comprehensive campus-based sexual assault bill in the country, and it included important elements around prevention programming. So by having someone based at the coalition, we're able to ensure that the implementation of that law is consistent throughout the state. So that's my advocacy for a statewide person. Now, what happens with the rest of these dollars? In New Hampshire, they get divided up among the 12 rape crisis centers. So on the one hand, while spreading that not very large pot of money out across the whole state means that no single program gets a huge amount of money, the benefit is that prevention programming is happening in every corner of our state. In New Hampshire, RPE funds are the only funds that come to crisis centers or coalitions directed towards sexual assault prevention programming. There are no other federal dollars specifically earmarked for this, and we certainly don't get any state dollars in New Hampshire to do this work. Another benefit of ensuring that every rape crisis center receives RPE funds is that if that rape crisis center is doing other prevention programming, maybe they found some other dollars to support it, that programming can be informed by the CDC's best standards. So for example, something that happened for us in New Hampshire is we had a local program that was having a really hard time getting into their schools to do prevention work, but they were able to pilot some non-RPE funded work at a local private school. And that then gave them the leverage to get into the public schools with some programming that did meet the CDC standards. Another benefit of having a cadre of RPE funded educators is that they can be a support system to each other. This has been especially true for us during COVID. For example, the best practice in prevention programming is to have 2 presenters. That hasn't always been possible during the pandemic. But what we have seen in New Hampshire is that seasoned educators have been able to step up even remotely and mentor or engage with newer educators, especially for larger audiences or for challenging topics. They've been able to share resources, slideshows, and even engage in shared remote presentations. So I'd like to wrap up by sharing a very brief anecdote that illustrates the last reason that I think it's really important to send RPE funds out to as many rape crisis centers as possible. When I was a new executive director in New Hampshire, I attended a prevention program by one of our member programs that's really known for using puppets in their primary prevention education. We were in a classroom of 5-year-olds all sitting cross-legged on the floor, and the puppet's main message was that if someone touches you, you should tell a trusted adult. And the room was pretty quiet, and a little girl in the back of the room quietly raised her hand and said, "But what if that's the adult who's touching you?" And the wonderful thing about having rape crisis center staff do prevention programming is that they are able to then connect someone, in this case, a 5-year-old little girl who made a disclosure, to the full range of services that are available at a rape crisis center. So thanks everybody for joining us today and for your interest in sexual assault and domestic violence. I look forward to being part of continued conversation about the reauthorization of VAWA and especially the important role that prevention can play. It's great to see everybody. Take care. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Teresa in Cleveland.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Teresa Stafford, the Chief Program Officer at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, and I bring greetings to you. Our mission at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, as you heard earlier, is to support survivors of rape and sexual abuse, promote healing and prevention, and advocate for social change. So I'm going to talk to you all a little bit now about, the folks on the ground that are doing the direct services with survivors of sexual violence every single day. How do we accomplish our mission at the Rape Crisis Centers? We do this by providing survivors and the community access to a crisis line that is available 24/7. So that hotline is supported by trauma specialists who are available to meet the needs of survivors at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the morning. The trauma specialists at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center are able to, communicate with people via telephone, text and chat, or even show up in person at a local hospital or police department to provide that in-person support as soon as a person engages with the system after being sexually victimized. Our victim advocates are so important and crucial in this process that they support survivors as they navigate an unfamiliar system when we're talking about the criminal justice system or other systems such as child protective services. And we know today, due to the sexual assault kit initiatives across the country, where many sexual assault kits sat in police departments going untested, how important the role of victim advocates are into ensuring that victim rights are uplifted and that victims have that support as they navigate these unknown waters. When a survivor is ready, regardless of when their victimization took place, it could have been 5 hours ago, 5 years ago, but whenever they're ready, we have trauma counseling services available for them. They can access these services via individual counseling or also group counseling. You know, we have recognized and listened to survivors and understand that for some survivors, there are barriers that impact their abilities to stay engaged in services or even access our services in the first place. Some of these barriers may include transportation, housing, access to food, or even some of the basic necessities that we take advantage of every single day. When a survivor has to think about these other items, sometimes it can impact their ability to stay engaged or access our services. So we have case managers that really help out in this space for survivors. And I think it's so important that we have these case managers because what we also identified was that perpetrators use these vulnerabilities against survivors to continuously victimize them. So it's so important that we are thinking about not only how can we help that survivor today, but how can we possibly prevent future victimization when we engage with them. We also know that it is so important, and we believe that sexual violence is preventable, folks. And that's why education, as you heard earlier, and community awareness is essential to the work that we're doing every single day. We have our education specialists out in the schools, out in the community, talking to young folks, talking to men, talking to ladies, talking to everyone about their role in combating sexual violence. It is so important that we continue not only providing the direct services that survivors need, but ensuring that communities are educated and have awareness around the topics of sexual violence. As you all know, we are in the midst of a pandemic. We have seen that increase of survivors being victimized and needing access to our services. Through our hotline, we've learned that one survivor was scared to access medical services because of COVID. The survivor literally said, I would rather get an STD than to go into the hospital. And so I think it's so crucial that we continue working with our community partners, continuously making sure that survivors have access in a manner in which they feel safe and they are able to access these services in a timely fashion. We also know that during the shift, a population of survivors were not able to fully access services due to the lack of technology or having lack of access to being able to gain telehealth services. So it's so important for survivors of sexual violence and for rape crisis centers to really think about how they can reach everyone in the midst of this pandemic. Individuals with intersecting identities, such as race, sexual violence, sexual orientation, gender, class, are often at a greater risk of victimization. We know that communities of colors experience sexual violence at a higher rate compared to other communities. And you're probably thinking, why is this? Well, we are definitely seeing that sometimes there's a different response due to people's identities that they carry. And perpetrators know that oftentimes there's less accountability due to the identity of the survivor. So it's so important that sexual assault programs continuously receiving culturally specific funding so we can meet the needs of survivors in a culturally responsive manner that understands the impact and challenges that survivors of color face. In 2020, the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center served over 24,000 survivors. Like many Rape Crisis Center programs across the country, we were greatly impacted by the Victim of Crimes Act cuts. In 2020, we received over a $2 million cut. That is 50% of our operating budget. And this year, we anticipate receiving another $1 million cut. What does this mean for survivors in our community? We're constantly having to shift how we deliver our services, and then caseloads for those counselors and victim advocates and case managers continuously increase. And we have to think about the quality of the services that survivors are receiving due to having to make this shift. We know that these cuts are impacting the communities we serve, it's impacting staff, and it's impacting the healing process for some. For instance, when the schools opened back up during the pandemic, our referrals for children who experience violence, who experience sex abuse, increased tremendously. Were our programs equipped? Absolutely. But did services received in a timely fashion due to the cuts? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. We have to be in the position where we are ready to meet the needs of communities. One of the bravest things a survivor of sexual violence can do is pick up the phone and call a rape crisis center and ask for help. It is crucial that our programs are funded appropriately to be able to meet the needs of the communities. No survivor deserves the victimization that they experience, and they sure as heck don't deserve to be put on a waiting list when they are so brave to come forward. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over now to Tammy Zhang.
Thank you so much for that, Teresa. And thank you everybody so much for joining the call today. Again, my name is Tammy Zhang, pronouns she, her, hers, and I currently serve as the Executive Director for the Hmong American Women's Association, also known as VAWA in Milwaukee. And as always, we're so lucky to be represented by Congresswoman Moore, who has obviously been such a huge avid champion for supporting domestic and sexual violence survivors. And to get that shout out, it totally made my day. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Moore. At VAWA, it's our mission to organize Southeast Asian women, girls, queer, and trans people to champion gender justice and collective liberation. And so then you can see that our work as a culturally specific grassroots organization really works at the intersections of gender and race. And so while our work is largely focused on supporting Southeast Asian women, girls, queer, and trans people impacted by sexual and domestic violence, we also know that in order to end sexual violence in our communities, we must also do the work in providing education and awareness to our communities so that we can truly end gender-based violence. Largely, our work is funded through VOCA and VAWA for the services that we provide at VAWA. We are only one of very, very few culturally specific organizations in this country led by Southeast Asian women and queer femme women that provide sexual assault supportive services for our communities. And what we know to be absolutely true and essential to survivors is that they really have access to services that not only speaks their language, but also understands how violence is experienced and how survivors navigate harmful cultural systems, which often leaves them isolated in communities. So our work and our job and our responsibility is really to reach out to survivors, to let them know that they are not alone. And as members of their communities, we are here to help support and help them with the help that they may need. When providing the support for survivors, it's also important to know that organizations like VAWA are trusted folks in our communities, and we are constantly responding to the needs of our community. So when our survivors had to navigate this global pandemic, we really were the first ones to respond to making sure that our survivors had the right information about COVID-19 and that they had essential items to support them during a really scary time. And so in 2020 alone, we served over 3,000 community members. So you can see that even during a pandemic, we remained open, serving our communities, making sure the survivors and their families had what they needed. Because we realized that for so many of them, we were their only support system. And so for a smaller grassroots nonprofit to be able to serve community during that time, we certainly as an organization are really proud that we were able to do that. So again, I hope that this really goes to show you that sexual assault services are essential when you think about the health and safety of communities, right? Making sure that culturally specific organizations like VAWA are invested in, because we are able to reach those survivors in our communities and work really hard to make sure that as a community, we're helping and supporting survivors in the way that they actually need to be supported. And I think it's really important for me to end my section with sharing a story about a Hmong woman survivor that has actually come to us for services. And so to protect her identity, we'll call her Mai for now. And Mai was just really 11 years old when she started experiencing sexual abuse from her father and lived years of her life being sexually abused by him, right? And her father was also a very prominent community leader. And she was absolutely convinced that no one in our community would ever believe her and the abuse that she was experiencing. And so it wasn't until years later when she was an adult and after many years in therapy that she realized that the harm that was done to her was not her fault. And even in the midst of being in therapy, Mai realized that the piece that she needed more than anything was the support of her own community, right? And so when she heard of VAWA and she heard about our work with survivors, she immediately connected with us. And ever since then, we have been building sisterhood ever since. So this is really the power of our work, the power of culturally specific organizations, because we are a place in our communities where survivors can come to that where they know that they will be believed, right? And we also become a second support system to them because we know that when survivors come forward in our communities, they are often left isolated, right? And so I really hope that we continue to prioritize the safety of survivors and continue to push for more resources to make sure that survivors of violence really have access to the support that they need. And when we're thinking about those resources, that we're thinking about culturally specific organizations like VAWA. So I want to thank you so much for everyone's time today, and I will pass it along to Tammy Giroux with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center.
Thank you, Tammy. My name is Tammy Truitt-Giroux, and I'm the Executive Director for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. Good morning and good afternoon to some people. It's still morning in Alaska. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in this nation. Alaska has 229 of those tribes. 40% of the tribes reside in Alaska. VAWA has been a very impactful and important piece of legislation since its inception in 1994. And the Title IX, which is specifically addressing tribal communities, is also very important for the sovereignty of each tribe and the government that each tribe operates. The important pieces of this is that each tribe have their own laws and systems. They also have their own histories and beliefs. Every tribe is different culturally, and in many other ways. There are similarities, but we have to be very mindful and careful to understand that each of our cultures may look at things a little bit differently. But the one thing that we do know is there is not one approach to preventing or responding to sexual assault or domestic violence. And it's crucial to continue to address the unique legal and policy needs of the villages and tribes that we work with. These needs have for too long been exempted from national policy change, especially in the issues of domestic violence and sexual assault and related health and justice issues leading to disparities in our communities, in our tribes. The Resource Center has been very involved with our TA and technical assistance really related to tribes and tribal capacity and building the capacity in our own systems within our response, advocacy, justice, and all of the areas that we have been lacking in terms of resourcing. The VAWA reauthorization is also very impactful in the fact that it addresses these things in Title IX. In 2013, Alaska was left out, particularly because of some of our legal and policy issues, and we understand that. But across the nation, special jurisdiction meant that tribes could then start taking care of what was happening in accountability for people that were perpetrating against their tribal members on tribal land. And the issue that really has been, I think, really something that we need to educate to is that tribal sovereignty means also tribal responsibility. And so that's a responsibility to our citizens to be able to give services that are going to help create healthy and healing in our community members and our communities ourselves. The fact is that it's very misunderstood in terms of our justice systems and other systems. And I can only speak to my tribe because that's oftentimes the only tribe I really have the very intimate knowledge about. But the point of that is that each of us has the ability and the responsibility to be able to speak for our own tribes and be able to make those changes from within. Sexual assault survivors are oftentimes going without services, period. And particularly in Alaska, where we have very high numbers of sexual assault survivors and oftentimes have no ability to get the services necessary in order to, if we wanted to report, to do a rape kit, in order to even get good healthcare system. And there's really been very minimal types of health and counseling types of systems for survivors of sexual assault. The other very large, and I think it's a capacity issue, is the fact that without the resources, our tribes are the forgotten communities. And again, I don't think that it's a situation that we cannot change, because I think we can. I think we have the answers. And I think that supportive legislation is how we start that process. Now, there are 19 tribal coalitions in this nation, and those coalitions do work with the tribes in their regions and their communities that are working towards interpersonal violence and sexual assault and the responses that those tribes are needing and the citizens are needing in those tribes. There's one particularly, Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, who has done much work. The Garden of Truth was a wonderful report that I would recommend that anyone would read for some really informative and, I think, heartfelt information. And I don't think that anyone that does this work cannot say that it isn't from the heart. And that's what we're really talking about when we talk about reauthorization and we talk about Title IX and we talk about the resources to have our communities be able to make the decisions that we need to make the changes that we have to make. I love that Congresswoman Moore stated, I want to be out of a job before my grandchildren reach the age that they may need these things. I think that that's what we should all try to attain. And thank you so much for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you all for giving us of your time, your talent, and more importantly, the commitment that you have to ending sexual violence. And I couldn't agree more in echoing Congresswoman Moore's sentiments. I say all the time that I get up every day glad to be doing this work, and I go to bed every night hoping that I don't have to continue to do it. And that is, I think, how most of us feel for those of us who have committed our time and talent to this work. And again, thank each of you for joining us. Terry, it doesn't appear that Congressman Joyce was able to join. So if you'd like to play the video so that people can hear his words. Again, Congressman Joyce represents Ohio's 14th district and is the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force on Sexual Assault.
I'm going to try to share my screen and do that. Teresa was trying to help me know how to do something I should have figured out before I did this, which is to make sure the audio is able to be heard. And I think, is there a particular button on Zoom that I need to push, Teresa? I'm so sorry to be asking you that.
No, when you had the opportunity to share your screen, it should have said, do you use the computer? It should have like been a little box that you could click that said, do you want to use your computer sound?
Let me try
I
that.
think in the lower left-hand corner.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
See how multifaceted our Rape Crisis Center staff are?
2, 1.
Hello, everyone. Congressman Dave Joyce here. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for the important work you're doing during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. As someone who was a prosecutor for 25 years, I encountered a lot of terrible crimes, but few haunt me more than those of sexual violence. That's why I helped found the Bipartisan Task Force to End Sexual Violence here in the U.S. House of Representatives. Together, across party lines, we are working to address these horrific crimes, explore ways to combat them, and determine how we can better support survivors. Back home in Ohio, I've held forums to hear from those who work to accomplish these same goals at the local level, like the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, Case Western Reserve University Beacon Center, and members of our law enforcement community. As we continue to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic, it's critical that Congress further its efforts to understand how state and local organizations that tackle sexual violence have been impacted so that we can properly support them at the federal level. We must be relentless in our pursuit of justice for survivors, unwavering in our commitment to provide them with improved services, and ensure the response to these horrific crimes is collaborative and results in holding those who commit them responsible. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and keep up the great advocacy work. Your efforts matter, and they are having an impact. God bless and stay well. Hello, everyone. Congressman Dave Joyce here.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for our tech assistants from both Teresa and Maddie. I know that you were also in the chat. We are very gracious to all of our multifaceted, multi-talented advocates who are providing support to us. And again, I'd be remiss if I did not thank again Terry Poor and Maureen Gallagher for their background support for ensuring that this happened. And a huge heartfelt gratitude and thank you to our speakers for the work that you've done and for giving us your time today to share both the stories and experiences of your survivors in your communities, as well as the direct work that you do and the collaborative supportive policy work that you do at the coalition as well. Both our tribal coalitions and our state coalitions and state and territorial coalitions. Terry has included our ask for today in the chat, but I will read them out loud as a reiterate, and please feel free to cut and paste them for people to ensure that you are able to share these with your friends, colleagues, board members, and your community members alike. Our first two asks for the Senate is asking the Senate to take action to for the VOCA fix, Senate Bill 611, which you heard Teresa speak eloquently about the direct impact to the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, and that is the case all across this country. We have senators who have not co-sponsored to co-sponsor and support Senate Bill 611. As you all know, the Violence Against Women Act did pass the House, so we are now strongly encouraging, and please do the same, for the Senate to reauthorize VAWA based on the Service Provider Bill, House Bill HR 1620 that passed the House earlier, including the funded involvement of state sexual assault coalitions in the rape prevention education program, which you heard Lynn speak directly to. This is our ask for all of Congress to continue the amazing work that we do, to continue to build the infrastructure and to ensure that no one has to wait on therapeutic services, support services, which is these three asks, which again are in your chat. Fund the Sexual Assault Services Program at the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice at $100 million. Provide steady funding and funding for tribes from the Crime Victims Fund, and increase funding to $75 million for rape prevention and education programs at the CDC. Again, these asks are in your chat. We have just about 5 minutes. Terry has attempted to answer any questions that are in the chat. And so if there are questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. And again, if we can answer them here, we will provide that information for you. And if not, as noted in the chat for a question we've already received, that someone from the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence will be in touch to ensure that we answer questions, provide resources and information, and hopefully continue to make the work that you do in your local communities a success on behalf of survivors of sexual violence.
And we're so grateful to the staff of members of Congress that have joined us today. And we appreciate you taking forward these asks to your members too. And we hope that this was helpful in understanding the work we do. And we're always available to reach out. Monica is our wonderful president. I'm doing policy full-time for the Alliance. Ellen Fern, government affairs consultant, is on here, and Maureen Gallagher, who focuses on state policy. So we're all here to serve you and support you in your efforts to support your members in being great advocates for sexual assault survivors and sexual violence prevention. Check in the chat. I don't know if we've had any additional questions come in. I'm going to drop also my email in the chat in case anybody needs follow-up information.
And certainly someone has requested that. So please, if we miss that you've requested these ask in writing, Terry's email is in the chat and she will certainly get those asked to you.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question, which are the RCCs? If I understand this, there's a little over 1,500 rape crisis centers. And when we say rape crisis center, we mean a local program that could be providing sexual assault services in a variety of formats. Some, like the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, is a standalone sexual assault program. That's what they do every day, all day. A lot of programs, probably around half, provide both sexual assault and domestic violence services. Like they might have a domestic violence shelter, but also have a rape crisis program. Some programs are provided in a multi-service agency. We still call that a rape crisis program because they have that segment. And then, as Tammy said, we have a few but need more culturally specific programs who really provide that response embedded in their particular community. So those are some examples, and I think if that is getting at your question about rape crisis centers, and those programs directly benefit from federal programs like the Sexual Assault Services Program, which is in goes through the Commerce, Justice, and Science bill, where right now Congresswoman Moore has just finished circulating a dear colleague letter on that. We certainly are asking members to request $100 million for the Sexual Assault Services Program. And then those programs also administer, as Lynn talked about and others, the Rape Prevention and Education Program, which provides primary prevention in communities. And that program runs through the CDC, through the HHS budget, and we're also asking members to put in requests for that program as well. And then the Crime Victims Fund is so incredibly essential. I always tell people that when I started in this work 25 years ago, my first job was funded by VOCA. It really provides the bread and butter funding on the ground for programs to support advocacy services. And so the deposits in that fund are incredibly low. It's a huge priority to get Senate Bill 611 passed. We're hoping it will be hotlined next week, perhaps. We hope there will be movement on it soon. Last check, I think there were 43 co-sponsors. So please, everybody, if you represent a Senate office, please can ask your boss to co-sponsor it. If you're at a local program, please reach out and ask that your senators co-sponsor this. The video will be available for viewing. We will tweet it from @ENDSXLViolence. I also think we'll put it on our website, so that will also be available. Please feel free to reach out to me if you didn't get the resources you need to follow up during this, if you want the video or if you want to make sure you have background materials, please follow up with us. And Ellen's pointing out in the chat that S611 is up to 45 co-sponsors, so that's really great.
That's great. And thank you, Maureen, for noting that we also kept using the acronym of RCC, but it is Rape Crisis Center. So thank you for noting that. The same thing we do for RPE, which is for Rape Prevention Education. But thank you again for ensuring that we're fixing our use of the acronyms or alphabet soup.
So many acronyms. Thank you for clarifying that. I think we are wrapping up on time.
Perfect. Thank you. And again, thank you for everyone who attended. For staffers, for any follow-up, please feel free to grab Terry's email out of the chat. Again, to receive any information or follow-up resources regarding this. And again, thank you to all of our advocates and survivors alike who joined us and continue to ensure that your voices are heard at the congressional level. Thank you all very much for joining us.